Okay, so you guys have really sent us some fascinating stuff this time around.
Yeah.
A lot to dig into
Indeed.
about the Indian judiciary.
Absolutely.
And specifically focusing on like the independence of the Supreme Court and the high courts.
Yeah.
And like this whole ongoing discussion about how judges get appointed.
Hmm.
So for this deep dive, I think what we want to do is kind of unpack a few things.
Yeah, okay.
First, like what's the constitutional basis for judicial independence in India? Like why is this such a big deal?
Yeah.
Second, this whole thing about the basic structure doctrine. I feel like that's come up a lot in what you guys have sent.
Yes, that's a core issue.
And then finally, like the history and the legality of how the judiciary itself plays a role in appointments.
Yeah.
So that means looking at the Collegium system and also this whole story about the NJAC, which I think you're much more familiar with than I am.
Right, the National Judicial Appointments Commission.
Exactly.
Right.
So you ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, awesome.
It's a crucial topic for understanding the dynamics of power.
Okay, so one of the things that really stood out to me in the stuff that you sent over was this idea that the Supreme Court and the high courts aren't just sort of beholden to the popular will in the same way that Parliament is.
Right.
And I feel like that's kind of a key starting point given some of the discussions that we see kind of floating around.
It is, and your sources very correctly point this out, that India is a constitutional republic, unlike, say, the UK,
Right.
which follows a system of parliamentary sovereignty.
Right.
Here, the Constitution is supreme.
Yeah.
And Parliament derives its authority from the Constitution
Gotcha.
and functions within the limits prescribed by it.
Okay.
This was a very deliberate choice by the framers
Right.
to ensure the independence of the judiciary from any political or legislative influence.
Yeah, because if the courts were basically just, signing off on whatever the government of the day or the majority in Parliament wanted, then their whole purpose as a check and balance would be totally gone.
Exactly.
Well,
it would defeat the purpose of having an independent judiciary.
And so that's where this whole idea of the basic structure doctrine becomes so important, right?
Absolutely.
So like you mentioned, it kind of evolved
Yes.
as a response to times when you had governments
Ah.
with really strong parliamentary majorities
Yes.
that were trying to amend the Constitution
Yeah.
in ways that could have like restricted the power of judicial review.
Yes. Yes.
So is this sort of like the Supreme Court drawing a line in the sand and saying like,
It is.
look, even if you have this huge majority, there are certain core things about this document that you can't touch.
Yeah, you cannot touch.
Like what kind of things are we talking about here?
So the Constitution itself doesn't give an exhaustive list,
Okay.
but the Supreme Court in various judgments has identified certain core principles.
Okay.
These include the supremacy of the Constitution, the federal and secular nature of India, the separation of powers between the different organs of the state,
Okay.
and importantly for our discussion today, the independence of the judiciary.
Gotcha.
The idea is to ensure that no single organ
Right.
becomes all-powerful and thereby undermines
Okay.
the very basic structure of our democracy.
Gotcha.
You can think of it like a building.
Yeah.
You can renovate the rooms,
Yeah.
but you cannot demolish the foundation
Right. That makes total sense.
without the building collapsing.
Okay.
So that's the idea behind the basic structure.
Okay. Now, one of the things that I see a lot,
Yeah.
and this kind of comes up in the material you sent over,
Right.
is this whole idea of, well, you have this unelected judiciary making decisions that affect so many people.
Mm-hmm.
And people kind of question, like, well, is that really legitimate?
Yeah.
Like, you see this all over social media, especially when there's like a big Supreme Court ruling.
And this is a valid concern, and this
Yeah.
is what fueled many discussions about the NJAC as well, which sought to give a role to the executive
Okay.
and the legislature
Okay.
in the appointment of judges.
Gotcha.
But we need to remember how our system is set up.
Mm-hmm.
The Constitution, which represents the will of the people as expressed through the Constituent Assembly,
Right.
establishes 3 independent organs of the state,
Hmm.
the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary.
Okay.
And it places them on an equal footing.
Okay.
This is the principle of separation of powers.
So it's not that the argument is that the judiciary should be elected.
Exactly.
But rather that their authority flows from the Constitution itself.
Exactly.
Which was created by the elected representatives of the people back when it was written.
Yes, and also that the judiciary's accountability isn't through elections, but through the administration of justice,
right,
ensuring access to justice for all, including timely justice, and upholding the rule of law.
Okay.
Also, as your sources point out, the separation of powers in India isn't perfect.
Right.
Often, the executive wields a lot of influence over the legislature.
Right.
And that makes an independent judiciary even more crucial.
To kind of balance things out.
For maintaining a balance of power.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so now let's get into how this independent judiciary actually gets its members.
Okay.
So the material you sent, it lays out, the constitutional articles 124 and 217 about appointing Supreme Court and High Court judges.
Yes.
And it says the president does this in consultation with judges.
Yes.
But that phrase, in consultation with, that has a pretty big history behind it, right?
It's history.
It's not as simple as it sounds.
It's not simple at all.
Okay, so let's walk through that.
Okay.
So the first judge's case back in 1981.
Yes.
It gave us the initial interpretation.
Yes. That was the majority view then.
Right. But even then, there were questions about it.
Yes. Even then, a 3-judge bench raised doubts and suggested that a larger bench should look into it again.
Okay, so that wasn't the end of the story.
No.
So what happened next in this legal journey?
Then came the second judge's case in 1993, where a 9-judge bench by a 7.2 majority overruled the first judge's case.
Wow. Okay.
This is crucial because this established what we call the primacy of the Chief Justice of India's opinion in judicial appointments.
Okay.
The court said that consultation doesn't just mean exchanging ideas.
Right.
It means that the CJI's recommendations carry a lot of weight.
Okay.
It gives the judiciary primacy in these appointments.
Okay, so it's not just like a casual chat anymore.
No, not at all.
The Supreme Court basically said, look, the CJI's got to have the final say.
Yes, primacy in the appointments.
That's a huge shift from just a few words in the Constitution.
It is, it is.
But the story doesn't stop there.
No, it doesn't.
We have the presidential reference in 1998.
Yes.
What prompted that?
So after the second judge's case, the Union of India still had some doubts about what exactly this judgment meant. So the president, using his power under Article 143 of the Constitution, asked the Supreme Court for its opinion on 9 questions related to judicial appointments. And again, a 9-judge bench unanimously answered these questions.
Wow.
Further solidifying the interpretation that consultation means giving primacy to the judiciary.
Okay, so by 1998, it's pretty much settled through these Supreme Court decisions that when it comes to picking judges for the high courts and the Supreme Court, the judiciary itself has the upper hand.
That's right. Okay.
The upper hand.
And that leads to this whole thing with the Memorandum of Procedure in 1999, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the Union of India then framed the Memorandum of Procedure to be in line with these Supreme Court judgments.
Right. So they're essentially saying, okay, we're going to codify this into how appointments actually happen.
Yeah, formalize the process.
It's interesting how just a few words in the Constitution
can end up having this huge ripple effect on how power actually works in a country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the beauty and complexity of our Constitution.
Totally. Okay. Now, in the material that you sent over, there's a quote from Justice Pagwadi in the first judge's case.
Oh, yes.
Even though that case was later overturned.
Yeah.
What was his take on judicial independence back then?
So Justice Pagwadi eloquently described the noble concept of judicial independence. He called it a fundamental pillar of our democracy and the bedrock of the rule of law. He said that the judiciary acts as a guardian of the citizens' rights against executive excesses. And he argued that this independence goes beyond just not being influenced by the executive. It extends to being free from all kinds of influence, be it political, economic, or even personal bias.
So it's not just about checks and balances within the government.
It's more than that.
But it's really about ensuring that justice is impartial.
Yes.
And fair for everybody.
Yeah. For every individual, for every citizen.
Okay, now that brings us to the Collegium system.
Okay.
Which, as we understand it, sort of came out of the second judge's case and the 1998 presidential reference.
Yes, that's right.
But then we had this whole attempt to replace it with the NJAC.
Yes.
So what was the thinking behind that?
So the Collegium system, while it was set up by the judiciary
Yeah.
to protect its independence,
Mm-hmm.
also faced criticism
Yeah, I can imagine.
for being opaque
Right.
and not accountable enough.
Okay.
So in 2015, the Parliament, through the 99th Constitutional Amendment Act,
Okay.
tried to set up a new body,
Okay.
the National Judicial Appointments Commission, or NJAC,
Okay.
to appoint judges to the Higher Judiciary.
Okay.
This was meant to replace the Collegium system.
Okay.
This NJAC would have members from the executive, like the Prime Minister and the Law Minister, the legislature, the leader of the opposition, and the judiciary, the Chief Justice of India.
And 2 senior Supreme Court judges.
Okay.
Plus, there would be 2 eminent jurists selected by a committee of the Prime Minister, the CJI, and the leader of the opposition.
Wow. Okay.
So it was meant to be a much more diverse body.
Okay, so it was a much more inclusive kind of setup.
Yes, more inclusive.
Than just having the judiciary doing it themselves.
Yes.
But it didn't last very long.
I didn't.
The NJAC was stayed by the Supreme Court right away.
Immediately.
And then it was eventually struck down.
Struck down.
Why was that?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court, by a 4.1 majority, declared the 99th Amendment unconstitutional.
Wow.
The main reason they gave was that it would compromise the independence of the judiciary.
Okay.
They said that having members from the executive and legislature in the NJAC would mean that the judiciary could be influenced by the other branches of government.
Right, which takes us right back to that whole point about why judicial independence matters so much in the first place.
It seems like the Supreme Court saw this as a direct attack.
Yes.
On that very principle.
On that very principle.
Okay, so now in the material that you've sent, there's some really interesting stuff about the debates that happened in the Constituent Assembly.
Yes.
Specifically, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's views on how judges should be appointed.
Yes, very insightful.
So what were the framers thinking about back then?
So the Constituent Assembly debates of May 24th, 1949 show us how much thought they put into this.
Okay.
Dr. Ambedkar mentioned 3 main proposals.
Okay.
1, appointment only if the Chief Justice agreed. 2, appointment that needed Parliament's approval.
Okay.
And 3, appointment after consulting a body like the Council of States.
Gotcha.
The main thing everyone agreed on was that the judiciary should be competent and independent.
Okay.
They were worried about both the British model, where the executive had too much power over appointments, and the American system, where the legislature had to confirm the appointments, especially because India was a new democracy. They felt that involving the legislature too much could lead to political influence and make appointments biased that would undermine the judiciary's neutrality. So they were looking for a middle ground, a way to ensure competence and independence without giving too much power to any one branch.
So it sounds like they were really struggling with this.
They were.
Trying to find a good balance.
Trying to find a balance that would work for India. Yes.
It's amazing to think that these same questions are still being debated today.
Absolutely. Still relevant. Even today.
Okay, now the stuff you sent also talks about the U.S. system and some potential problems with it.
It does.
So what are some of the comparisons and what concerns do they raise?
So the key difference is how separation of powers works in India versus the U.S. In India, the executive often controls the legislature. In the U.S., the president doesn't control Congress. So in the U.S., even though the Senate confirms judges, there's a risk of what's called court packing, where presidents appoint judges just because they agree with their ideology. Like when President Trump appointed judges and then Roe v. Wade was overturned. So in India, where the executive is so powerful, giving more power to the legislature over judicial appointments could be risky for judicial independence.
Okay, so they're not saying that the U.S. system is bad.
Not necessarily.
But they're saying that just taking that one piece and putting it into the Indian context might not work.
It might not work.
It's about understanding the whole context.
Context is everything.
And the balance of power.
Yes, the balance of power.
Within a specific system.
Within each system.
Before you just copy and paste.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's recap. What are the key takeaways?
Okay, so the main takeaway is that India's founders chose to have an independent judiciary. They believed in the supremacy of the Constitution over the will of Parliament. The basic structure doctrine protects the Constitution from being changed too much. Yeah. And the way judges are appointed has been a long and complex process, from interpreting consultation to the Collegium system and then the failed NJAC.
Right.
All of this shows how important judicial independence is in India.
And as the material you sent shows, this wasn't just some abstract idea for the framers.
No, it was a conscious choice.
They really wanted to protect the rule of law and make sure that no one branch of government had too much power.
Exactly. Checks and balances.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what they wanted.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something for everyone listening to think about.
Okay.
With all these different ways of appointing judges and overseeing the courts, what do you think are the most important things to consider when we're trying to make sure that courts are both independent and accountable?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
A delicate balance.
It's a big question, and it affects democracies everywhere, not just India.
That's right.
Okay, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
We'll see you guys next time.
See you next time. Okay, so, when you really start digging into how India is governed, you kind of quickly run into this push and pull, between the executive branch and the judiciary.
Absolutely.
And today we're going to really get into a fundamental idea that shapes that whole dynamic. And it's called the Doctrine of Basic Structure.
It's a fascinating one.
Right.
And the material you've given me, it really lays out this compelling story, how this doctrine came to be and why it's so central to India's whole legal system. I mean, we've got key legal texts here and analyses of these landmark Supreme Court judgments.
Right, exactly. So our goal, I guess, in this deep dive is pretty straightforward. We want to understand, what is this Doctrine of Basic Structure? How did it come about? And maybe most importantly, why does it matter so much in Indian constitutional law? And how does it play into that balancing act between different parts of the government?
Right.
Okay, so let's jump in. So if we rewind the clock and go back to right after India gained independence, Parliament had a lot of power back then, right?
They did.
Yeah.
Yeah, those early years, there was this real strong emphasis on the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, reflecting that fresh democratic mandate after independence. And the Constitution itself, actually, in Article 368, it gave Parliament the power to amend its own provisions.
And we see this power being used pretty early on with that First Amendment in 1951. And this wasn't just a minor tweak, right? This was a pretty big deal. It made some serious changes to fundamental rights, like the right to property. It went from being a fundamental right to just a legal provision.
Right.
And then you've got the introduction of Article 15.4 to support disadvantaged groups, and Article 31B becoming what they call non-justiciable for things like land reforms and reservations. It's a lot of change right out of the gate. And of course, it got challenged in court.
It did, naturally. And in those early cases, the Shankari Prasad case of 1951 and later the Sajjan Singh case in 65, the Supreme Court actually sided with Parliament's authority to make those changes. Their interpretation at that time really hinged on what the word law meant in Article 13. Now, Article 13, it says the state can't make laws that infringe on fundamental rights. And the court's thinking was that the word law there that referred to ordinary laws passed by Parliament, not to these constitutional amendments, which are done under Article 368. So at that point, Parliament's power to amend the Constitution, even when it came to fundamental rights, it seemed pretty much unlimited.
It's almost hard to imagine now that they once thought Parliament could change even those most basic rights without any real limits.
Yeah.
But you mentioned there were some dissenting opinions in that Sajjan Singh case, so that kind of hints that things might shift later on.
It does, yeah. While most of the judges agreed with upholding Parliament's power, there were a couple who raised a really important question. They asked, can the basic rights of citizens truly be left completely up to whatever the parliamentary majority decides? So this dissenting view, it planted a seed. It suggested that maybe there were some inherent limits to how much Parliament could change the Constitution.
So then a few years later, in 1967, we get to the Goloknath case. Now, this one seems like a major turning point, almost a complete reversal from how the Supreme Court had seen things before. What led to such a dramatic shift?
Goloknath was definitely a dramatic shift. The Supreme Court completely changed its stance and declared that Parliament actually did not have the power to amend fundamental rights. They basically said any changes to those fundamental rights would need a whole new Constituent Assembly, as a separate body from the existing Parliament.
Wow, that's a huge difference. So what was the reasoning behind this big turnaround?
The court argued that fundamental rights, they hold this sort of transcendental position in the Constitution, They're not subject to the kind of parliamentary restrictions you see outlined in Article 13.
Okay.
They also reinterpreted Article 368. They said instead of it being this source of unlimited amending power, Article 368 only lays out the procedure for amendments. Not that it grants the power to change every single part of the Constitution, especially not the fundamental rights.
So they're basically saying, here's the process, but there are some things that are off limits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is where that concept of implied limitations on Parliament's amending power really took hold. The court basically said that when the Indian people adopt the Constitution, they inherently reserve certain freedoms for themselves. Those are beyond the reach of ordinary parliamentary amendments.
Interesting. So it's like saying you have the rule book, but some core principles are non-negotiable.
Exactly.
I imagine this probably created some tension with the government. They weren't just going to sit back and accept this, were they?
Not really. You're right. The government under Indira Gandhi, they responded to Gulak Nath with a bunch of significant constitutional amendments, the 24th, 25th, 26th, and 29th Amendments. And these were direct attempts to basically overrule the Supreme Court's decision in Gulak Nath and some other cases like R.C. Cooper and Madhav Scindia, which had also gone against government policies on property rights and things like the privy purses of former rulers.
So this all builds up to the big one, the landmark Kesavananda Bharati case in '73. This is the birthplace of the basic structure doctrine. Can you kind of set the scene for us? What was the specific issue they were dealing with?
Sure. The immediate issue was a challenge to land reform laws down in Kerala. These laws were impacting how religious properties were managed, and these management rights were protected under Article 26 as a fundamental right.
Okay.
The people who brought the case, they argued these land reform laws were messing with their fundamental right to manage their religious institutions. But the case quickly expanded to this much bigger question. Does Parliament have any limit at all to its power to amend the Constitution? Could it change or even completely get rid of any part, including those fundamental rights that citizens have?
Okay, so big stakes. And what did the Supreme Court decide in Kesavananda Bharati?
It was a really significant judgment, but also a complex one. They said that while no part of the Constitution, including fundamental rights, was totally untouchable by Parliament's amending power, that power wasn't unlimited. They introduced this concept of the basic structure of the Constitution. And they said this basic structure cannot be taken away or destroyed even by a constitutional amendment.
Interesting. So Parliament can amend but not rewrite the whole foundation.
Exactly. It's like you said, you can renovate a house, but you can't demolish the foundation and build something totally different.
So the court now had a way to judge whether an amendment went too far. But what exactly is this basic structure? It seems kind of vague.
Yeah, it's not super clearly defined in the Kesavananda Bharati judgment itself, but several judges in that case, they did try to lay out some of the elements that they thought were part of it.
Okay.
For example, Chief Justice Sikri, he pointed to things like the supremacy of the Constitution itself, the fact that India has a republican and democratic form of government, the secular character of the state, the separation of powers, between the legislature, executive, and judiciary, and the federal character of the Constitution, which is that division of powers between the central government and the states.
So these are like the core principles, the untouchables.
Essentially, yes. And other judges added to the list, too, Justices Shalat and Grover. They included things like the mandate to build a welfare state, which is reflected in the directive principles of state policy, the unity and integrity of India, and the nation's sovereignty.
Okay.
Justices Hegde and Mukherjee, they had a similar list. They emphasized India's sovereignty, its democratic character, the country's unity, the essential freedoms of individuals, and again, that goal of building a welfare state.
It seems like there are some common threads running through all these different lists.
Right. There's definitely a convergence on certain core principles.
What about Justice Jaganmohan Reddy? He focused on the preamble, right?
He did. He argued that the preamble to the Constitution that kind of sums up the basic features of India. He saw it as a sovereign democratic republic committed to social, economic, and political justice for everyone, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, and equality of status and opportunity. So for him, the preamble was like this guiding light for figuring out what makes up the fundamental structure.
So we're seeing all these different but overlapping ideas about what's absolutely essential to the Indian Constitution. And the judgment itself, it had some pretty powerful statements about the need to balance progress with protecting individual freedoms.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this one line that stands out. It says, and I'm quoting here, "We are unable to agree with the contention that in order to build a welfare state, it is necessary to destroy some of the human freedoms. That, at any rate, is not the perspective of our Constitution. Our Constitution envisages that the state should, without delay, make available to all the citizens of this country the real benefits of those freedoms in a democratic way. Struggle between liberty and power is eternal. Our constitutional plan is to eradicate poverty without destruction of individual freedoms.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah.
So Kesavananda Bharati lays down this principle of the basic structure, but how has it actually been used and strengthened in the years since?
It's been tested and reinforced in a lot of important cases. One early example is the Indira Nehru Gandhi v. Raj Narain case from 1975. This was during the emergency period, and the Supreme Court actually struck down a specific clause of the 39th Amendment. This clause had tried to put the election of certain officials, including the Prime Minister, outside the reach of judicial review.
Wow.
The court said that this directly attacked the basic structure because it undermined free and fair elections, which are obviously a cornerstone of a democratic system.
That's a pretty bold move by the court, especially considering the political climate at the time.
Yeah, it was. And then the Minerva Mills case in 1980 that really solidified the doctrine. The court struck down amendments that had been made in the 42nd Amendment Act back in '76. They emphasized that the Constitution itself, not Parliament, is the ultimate authority. This case also specifically added judicial review to the list of basic features. That's the power of courts to review the validity of laws. And it also added the balance between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy as another basic feature. The court even said that the limited nature of Parliament's amending power itself is part of the basic structure.
Okay, so they can't just amend the Constitution to give themselves unlimited power.
Exactly.
So the power to amend is limited, and the courts are there to make sure those limits are respected. What other things have been recognized as part of the basic structure over time?
When the Indra Sawhney case from '92, that one dealt with reservations in government jobs, and it explicitly added the rule of law to the list of basic features. Then in '94, you got the S.R. Bommai case. That one came after the demolition of the Babri Masjid. And the court very clearly said that secularism is a fundamental part of the basic structure. This was a key reason why they felt it was justified to dismiss state governments that were seen as failing to uphold secularism.
And the court's own independence and powers, those have also been protected under this doctrine, right?
Yes, definitely. The L. Chandra Kumar case in '97, that one looked at the constitutionality of these administrative tribunals that had been created by the 42nd Amendment. And the court strongly affirmed that the power of judicial review that's given to the Supreme Court and the high courts under Articles 32 and 226, that's a core part of the basic structure because it makes sure there's that separation of powers and provides essential checks and balances on these tribunals.
So even laws that were put into the Ninth Schedule of the Constitution, which was originally meant to keep them safe from judicial review, even those haven't been totally shielded from the basic structure doctrine.
Right. You're thinking of the Ninth Schedule case IR, Quayle v. State of Tamil Nadu from 2007. That case reaffirmed the importance of the basic structure and said that even laws in the Ninth Schedule can still be challenged if they violate the basic structure.
Wow.
And the court emphasized that the Constitution is a living document. So what we understand is the basic structure that can change over time as new challenges come up.
And more recently, the right to privacy case in 2017, the Puttaswamy case that also used the basic structure doctrine.
It did. In that case, the court said that the right to privacy is a fundamental right under Article 21, and therefore it's a core part of the basic structure. And using this logic, they struck down parts of the Aadhaar Act that they saw as violating this fundamental right. Importantly, the Puttaswamy case also recognized that the right to sexual orientation is inherently connected to the right to privacy. And this ultimately helped lead to the decriminalization of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code and the broader recognition of LGBTQ+ rights and relationships.
So the basic structure doctrine, it's had a huge impact, touching everything from fundamental rights and the balance of power to big social issues. It's a vital check on the power of the legislature.
Absolutely. That's its main purpose. It's a safeguard against the legislature potentially overreaching, especially when there might be a temptation to weaken fundamental rights or upset that delicate constitutional balance. The emergency period is a stark reminder of why a mechanism like this is so important in democracy.
But there's always this debate, isn't there, about how flexible a constitution should be?
Yeah.
Some people argue that constitutions need to be adaptable to survive, even if that means changing things that seem pretty fundamental.
It's true, finding that balance between keeping the Constitution stable and allowing for necessary changes, that's an ongoing challenge in any democracy. But as it stands now, the basic structure doctrine, it came out of that Kesavananda Bharati case 50 years ago, and it's still this crucial shield, protecting the core principles of the Indian Constitution and the basic rights of its citizens. it puts limits on how much Parliament can change things. And any amendment that goes against this basic framework can be struck down by the courts. And historically, this doctrine has been really important in preventing India from slipping towards authoritarianism, especially at times when some governments have been hesitant to accept an independent judiciary.
So to put it simply, the Doctrine of Basic Structure basically says to Parliament, you can amend the Constitution, but you can't do it in a way that completely changes its core principles and the fundamental rights of the people.
Exactly. It's a cornerstone of Indian constitutional law. It's all about the separation of powers and protecting fundamental rights.
It's a really fascinating and super relevant part of how India works. So for you listening out there, I want you to think about this. Given that our society and the way we're governed is always changing, how might our understanding and application of the basic structure doctrine need to adapt in the years to come? To make sure we keep that balance between a stable constitution and the changes that a dynamic country like India naturally goes through. It's something worth reflecting on for sure.
Okay, so you're here with us because you want to understand the big stuff.
Right.
You want to get to the heart of things without getting bogged down in all the little details.
Right, exactly. And that's what this is all about, right? We're calling this the deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling two really foundational aspects of the Indian legal system.
Exactly. And we've got some fascinating material we've been going through that we're going to be drawing on for today's deep dive.
Yeah. And we're going to kind of explore the bedrock of the Constitution. So we're going to be looking at the basic structure doctrine.
Okay.
And where that idea came from, why it matters so much.
Right.
And then we'll shift gears a little bit and look at a very real-world challenge, the massive backlog of cases that are clogging up the courts, and what that means for people who are actually seeking justice. So think of this as your shortcut to getting a clear picture of these vital issues.
Yeah, I like that. So it's a shortcut to getting a clear picture. And today our goal is to really unpack the core principles at play and the practical hurdles that we're facing. Yeah. So let's dive right in.
Let's do it.
And let's start with that first one, the basic structure doctrine.
All right.
Now, this might sound a little bit academic.
Sure.
But stick with us, because it is the key to understanding how the Indian Constitution protects our fundamental freedoms from being swept away.
Absolutely. It's really the guardian. The basic structure doctrine is the guardian of the Constitution's core values.
Okay.
And the fundamental rights that you have as a citizen. So it prevents Parliament, even with a majority, from altering the essential framework of the Constitution.
Right.
It makes sure that the fundamental principles remain untouched.
Okay, so that sounds like a pretty significant idea.
It is.
Where did this even come from? There's got to be a story behind it.
There is. The intellectual roots of this doctrine actually lie in the theory of implied limitation. And this was developed by a German legal scholar named Professor Conrad.
Okay.
And his thinking was really heavily shaped by a very critical period in German history, the Weimar Republic.
Oh, the Weimar Republic. So that's Germany between World War I and the rise of Hitler, right?
Precisely. So the Weimar Constitution, it had a provision, it was Article 76, which allowed for amendments.
Okay.
If they secured a 2/3 majority in Parliament.
Okay, 2/3. So
now on the surface.
A pretty strong level of consensus, you would think.
You would think so, right. However, this very mechanism was chillingly exploited by Adolf Hitler to dismantle fundamental rights piece by piece.
Wow.
And consolidate his dictatorial power. So by 1933, he had used this amendment process to basically fundamentally alter the Constitution and strip away people's freedoms. And I think the subsequent emergency and the horrors of the Holocaust serve as a very stark lesson in what can happen when constitutional safeguards are either weak or non-existent.
A really disturbing example of how a seemingly democratic process can be totally twisted. So how did Professor Conrad react to this?
Yeah.
And what's his connection to India?
So Professor Conrad, he recognized the inherent danger in allowing a legislature, even with a large majority, to basically erase the very foundations of a nation's constitution.
Right.
So he argued that there must be inherent unspoken limits.
Okay.
Fundamental aspects that should be beyond the reach of even a supermajority to change.
Yeah.
What's really fascinating is that Professor Conrad actually visited India in 1968.
Wow, okay.
And gave a really important lecture at Banaras Hindu University.
Okay, the issue.
And the topic.
Yes.
The vital need to protect fundamental rights from being tampered with by parliamentary amendment.
That's a direct connection.
Yes.
So these ideas weren't just theoretical. They actually did influence the development of Indian law.
Directly so. Professor Conrad's insights were a major influence on the thinking that led to the Indian Supreme Court's adoption of the Basic Structure doctrine. In the pivotal 1973 Kesavananda Bharti case, so his work provided the intellectual justification for the court to assert that while the Indian Parliament has the power to amend the Constitution, that power isn't unlimited.
Right.
It cannot alter the Constitution's basic structure or its core features. Think of it like this. You can renovate a house.
Okay.
You can change the paint, maybe rearrange some walls, but you can't tear down the foundation.
Right.
And still call it the same house.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
Now, I remember reading that Professor Conrad used some pretty extreme hypotheticals in that lecture in India in '68 to really illustrate the dangers of this unchecked power.
Right.
Can you remind us of some of those?
Absolutely. So Professor Conrad used these thought experiments to highlight the potential for abuse if there were no fundamental limits on the power to amend the Constitution.
Right.
So he posed questions designed to test the very essence of Indian nationhood and individual rights. For instance, he asked, could the very structure of India, its federal nature, as outlined in Article 1, be changed so drastically that the country could be split into just two states?
Wow.
Say a Tamil Nadu and a Hind proper, simply through a constitutional amendment passed by a 2/3 majority.
That's a pretty extreme example.
It is right. Could Article 21, which guarantees the right to life and personal liberty, a cornerstone of our freedoms, be completely abolished by an amendment? Could the power to amend the Constitution itself be handed over entirely to the president, acting solely on the prime minister's advice?
Wow.
Effectively bypassing any parliamentary scrutiny. And in a truly dramatic example, he even asked if the amending power could be used to just throw out the entire Constitution.
Oh, my goodness.
And bring back a historical form of rule, like a Mughal emperor. Or the British crown.
Yeah, those are really extreme.
They are.
But I see his point. They force you to consider, like, where are the absolute limits?
Exactly. And so Professor Conrad emphasized that while these examples might sound outlandish, it's often by pushing the boundaries of possibility in our thinking that we truly understand the importance of fundamental legal principles. They underscore why certain core tenets must be protected from the shifting sands of political majorities.
Makes sense. Okay, that gives us a really clear understanding, I think, of the basic structure doctrine. And its crucial role in safeguarding the Constitution.
Absolutely.
Now let's turn our attention to that second major issue we wanted to explore. And this is the immense challenge of delayed justice in Indian courts. You often hear the saying, justice delayed is justice denied.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like the sheer numbers really paint a stark picture here.
They do. The sheer number of cases pending in Indian courts is staggering. And a particularly concerning aspect is that the Union of India, meaning the central government, and the various state governments are by far the biggest litigants. They account for nearly half.
Wow.
Almost 50% of all the cases that are filed.
Almost 50%. That's a massive chunk of the judicial system's workload.
It is.
Do we have a sense of just how many cases we're talking about across different government departments?
We do.
Like, to really understand the scale of this, let's look at some specific examples of how many cases individual government departments are grappling with.
So as of December 31st, 2022, the Finance Ministry alone had approximately 64,270 cases stuck in various courts.
Wow.
The Ministry of Labor and Employment was dealing with around 38,757. And the railways had a similar number, about 38,110.
Got it.
Other significant contributors to this backlog include the Ministry of Defense with over 23,000 pending cases, the Ministry of Home Affairs with more than 20,000, the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution with nearly 16,000. And even the Ministry of Education had over 12,000 cases awaiting resolution.
Wow. So those are really significant numbers.
They are.
For individual ministry. What about the overall picture across the entire judicial system? How many cases are we talking about in total that are pending?
So as of April 1st, 2023, the total number of pending cases was truly enormous. We're looking at 68,847 cases pending in the Supreme Court itself. And a staggering 60.76 lakh, that's over 6 million cases in the 25 high courts across the country.
6 million.
And if we look at the states with the highest burden of pending cases in their high courts and district and session courts, Maharashtra tops the list with almost 30,000.
Okay.
Followed by Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and West Bengal, all with well over 23,000 pending cases each.
It's just hard to fathom.
It is.
I mean, those numbers are huge.
Yeah.
It's hard to even fathom the impact that kind of backlog has on individuals,
right.
businesses trying to get justice. I mean, imagine
a family waiting years for a property dispute with a government body to be resolved.
Exactly. These aren't just numbers.
Right.
These are real people's lives.
They represent real lives on hold.
Now, I know the Supreme Court has spoken out about this.
They have.
Quite a bit, haven't they?
Absolutely. The Supreme Court has repeatedly and strongly urged both the central and state governments to make mediation a priority.
Okay.
And to avoid bringing unnecessary cases to court in the first place.
Yeah.
They've stressed the importance of weeding out what they call frivolous litigation.
Okay.
Even pointing out that in their estimation, at least 40% of the cases filed by government entities could be considered frivolous.
30%?
There was even a very telling remark made by one Supreme Court bench about a case involving a minuscule 700 rupees per month.
Wow.
For which the government had likely spent around 7 lakh rupees of taxpayer money fighting it in court.
700 versus 7 lakh.
That's 1,000 times.
That's incredible.
The amount in dispute.
So why are governments such major contributors to this massive backlog?
Right.
What are the underlying reasons?
So the former Chief Justice of India, Justice Ramana, he identified several key contributing factors.
Okay.
These include what he termed non-performing executives.
Okay.
Meaning a failure within the government to resolve issues administratively before they reach the courts.
Okay.
He also pointed to ambiguities in existing laws that lead to more litigation, the consistently low judge population ratio in the country, meaning too few judges to handle the volume of cases.
Got it.
And he even questioned why internal disagreements within the government or disputes between government-owned companies are called public sector undertakings, or PSUs.
PSUs, okay.
Which are essentially government-owned companies.
Right.
And the government itself end up clogging the court system. But beyond these kind of broad points, there are more specific reasons at play.
Yeah, like what are some of the specific things that are driving this?
So one significant factor is a deep-seated fear within government departments of scrutiny.
Okay.
From audit committees and finance teams. It's often perceived as the safer option to simply deny a payment or a claim and then file a legal case as a default response, rather than having to justify those payments to auditors later on.
So just punting the problem down the road.
Exactly. We even see instances like with certain Army pensions where government personnel unofficially advise veterans that the only way to resolve their issues is to take the legal route.
Wow.
Essentially outsourcing problem solving to the courts. Corruption, unfortunately, is another contributing factor.
Of course.
Delays in resolving financial matters can sometimes be exploited for personal gain.
Right.
Either through direct dealings with contractors or through referrals to certain lawyers.
Right.
So that's a problem as well.
So that paints a really kind of disheartening picture of the internal workings. Are there other kind of systemic issues at play here as well?
Yes. A significant one is a general lack of legal awareness and understanding.
Okay.
Within many government departments, they often tend to operate in a very technical, mechanical way.
Okay.
Sometimes adhering rigidly to old rules.
Right.
Even ignoring well-established judicial precedents. You see appeals being filed based on laws or judgments that have long been superseded.
Wow.
Perhaps most concerning, though, is a discernible reluctance within the government to simply accept when they might be in the wrong.
Okay.
The examples of the Divas arbitration case and the retrospective tax issue with Vodafone really illustrate this point.
Right.
In both of those high-profile instances when the government faced unfavorable judgments, in international or domestic courts, instead of accepting those decisions, they chose to amend the laws retroactively.
Wow.
To try to overturn those outcomes.
So it sounds like a really complex mix.
It is.
Of bureaucratic hurdles,
yeah,
potential corruption,
right,
a lack of legal understanding, and a certain unwillingness to concede defeat.
Yeah.
All kind of contributing to this problem. What about criminal cases?
Yeah.
Is the issue of delay a significant factor there as well?
Absolutely. In criminal cases, it's a very serious issue. It's not uncommon for investigating agencies to take far longer than the legally stipulated 90-day period to file their charge sheets, sometimes stretching to months or even years.
Wow.
This results in individuals being held in jail for extended periods as under trials,
Right.
sometimes for longer than the maximum sentence they might receive if convicted. The Supreme Court recently took a very firm stance on this issue, initially ruling quite strongly that what's called default bail should be automatically granted if the charge sheet wasn't filed within that statutory timeframe. However, the central government stepped in, arguing that investigative agencies often need more time to conduct thorough investigations, especially in complex cases.
Right.
And this initial ruling was subsequently recalled or put on hold.
So a bit of back and forth there.
It is. And this really highlights that tension between an individual's right to a speedy legal process and the state's need to effectively investigate and prosecute crime.
Yeah. So it's not always cut and dry.
It isn't.
Okay. And we also have some data on conviction rates.
We do.
For certain types of cases.
Yeah.
That's quite revealing, right?
It is. The conviction rate under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, or PMLA, provides a particularly stark example.
Okay.
The government recently informed Parliament that in the period between 2019 and late 2024, out of 654 PMLA cases where trials had actually been completed and reached a verdict, there were only 42 convictions.
Wow.
That translates to a conviction rate of just 6.42%.
That is a really low conviction rate.
It is. It raises significant questions about the effectiveness of the law in achieving its stated aims, as well as the immense burden these cases place on the judicial system.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about all the resources that are being spent and the potential for injustice.
Right.
If so few cases are actually resulting in a conviction after going through that whole process.
Exactly.
Now, as we start to wrap things up here, the material we've looked at also touches on this crucial issue of the independence of the judiciary.
Right.
And some of the steps that are being taken towards greater transparency within the system.
Yeah.
Can you give us a brief overview of that?
Certainly. Despite these significant challenges that we've been discussing, the Indian judiciary maintains its independence, particularly when it comes to the appointment of judges to the higher courts. Through what's known as the Collegium system. So this is the method by which the Indian judiciary itself plays the primary role in selecting judges for the Supreme Court and high courts. While this process does involve consultation with the executive branch of the government, the judiciary ultimately retains primacy in these appointments. It's also important to note that appointments to the lower judiciary, the courts where most people have their direct interactions with the legal system, are generally made through competitive examinations that also include established reservation policies to ensure broader representation. The judiciary emphasizes that its accountability is fundamentally to the Constitution itself. Through the fair and impartial administration of justice and the upholding of the rule of law, rather than simply reflecting the passing will of the political majority.
So not just going along with whatever the current government wants.
Exactly.
Now, there have been some notable efforts, I understand, towards greater openness.
There have been.
Accountability.
Yes.
Within the judiciary itself.
The judiciary has proactively taken several steps to enhance transparency. Many high courts are now making the details of the assets owned by their judges publicly accessible on their official websites. More significantly, the Supreme Court, under the leadership of Chief Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, has recently brought itself under the purview of the Right to Information Act, or the RTI Act, allowing citizens to seek information about its functioning, the resolutions of the Collegium, the body that recommends judicial appointments, along with the detailed reasons recorded for their decisions, are now also being published online. Furthermore, there's a significant push towards the digitization of court records and processes, the creation of repositories of judgments in multiple Indian languages to make them more accessible, and the live streaming of hearings in various courts across the country. Finally, regular national lok adalats, which are essentially alternative dispute resolution forums, are organized at the lower levels to help expedite the disposal of cases through mediation and conciliation.
Sounds like a lot of good stuff happening there.
Yeah.
The material we looked at also briefly mentioned the ongoing need for police reforms.
Right.
Especially given the government's significant role as a litigant.
Yes.
and the persistent issues with the delayed investigations and filing of charge sheets.
That's absolutely correct. Given the substantial contribution of government entities to the overall case backlog and the problems associated with delayed investigations that can impact both criminal and civil cases involving the state.
Right.
Meaningful police reforms are widely seen as a crucial and complementary step in tackling the broader issue of delayed justice and ensuring a more efficient legal system.
So pulling all of this together, it seems clear that while the Indian judicial system grapples with some really significant challenges,
it does.
Particularly this sheer volume of pending cases and the government's role within that.
Right.
There are also fundamental principles deeply embedded within it, like the Basic Structure Doctrine.
Yes.
Designed to protect our core rights.
Absolutely.
And there are ongoing efforts from within the judiciary itself.
Yes.
To improve transparency, efficiency, and access to justice.
Precisely. While there's undoubtedly a need for continued reforms and improvement, the foundational principle of an independent judiciary, one that is not subject to the direct control or whims of the executive branch through Parliament, remains absolutely vital for safeguarding the fundamental rights and freedoms of every citizen. The period of the emergency in 1975 serves as a stark and enduring reminder of the potential dangers when an independent judiciary is compromised. And the fundamental rights of citizens can be so easily and swiftly trampled upon, even in what might seem like grave times.
Yeah, that's a sobering but incredibly important point to keep in mind as we reflect on all of this. So we've taken a pretty comprehensive deep dive.
We have.
Into these two really critical aspects of the Indian legal system today. We've explored this absolutely essential role of the Basic Structure Doctrine in protecting the very core of the Constitution.
Absolutely.
And we've examined the immense and complex challenge posed by the staggering backlog of cases in the courts, with a particular focus on the government's significant contribution to that backlog.
And as you continue to think about all of this, consider the really delicate but crucial balance that must exist in any thriving democracy between firmly upholding fundamental principles that guarantee individual liberties and ensuring the efficient and timely administration of justice for everyone. What role does each of us as individuals within this complex system ultimately play in fostering a legal environment that is both deeply protective of our rights and truly responsive to our needs?
Some really profound food for thought to take away with us. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until our next exploration.